Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Getting to the Heart of Cancer. I'm your host, Dr. John Wadood-Laird. In the journey of cancer, loss is inevitable. When my wife was diagnosed with cancer, we lost a sense of innocence, I would say. And the prospect that we would live forever in marital bliss was trashed, it was destroyed. For the person with cancer, there is a loss of innocence, a loss of any sense of immortality, loss of capacity, maybe loss of body parts, loss of income potentially. There can also be a loss of friends as friends drift away, perhaps because of their own issues around cancer and how whatever their imaginations say about it. For the family members, there's potential loss and sometimes actually loss of a loved one. And there's many aspects of loss here. Also, grief is inevitable. When we have significant loss, there's grief. However, healthy grieving is a choice. Often we say that grieving is a personal matter, a private matter. And certainly that's true to a degree. But the question that this interview with Francis Weller brings up is, by making grieving so personal and private, have we really lost a vital capacity, really the capacity to grieve? Because healthy grieving leads to greater compassion and greater actual vitality. It's a blessing. Francis takes a radical perspective, and the meaning of radical here is getting to the roots of it. And to understand the roots of healthy grieving, he's traveled to and studied traditional methods of grieving, which are communal in nature. That is their basis. To the best of my knowledge, Francis is not a card-carrying Sufi. I have actually no idea what his breadth of his spiritual practice is. But when I first met him and listened to him, it was obvious to me that this is someone who has very deep realization in this area of grief and loss. And also he felt like a brother. I think this comes through in the interview that we had together at his office in Santa Rosa, California. And I found what he has to say to be of great importance, and I trust you will too. Hi, everybody. As promised, I'm here in Santa Rosa in the office of Francis Weller, someone who I first heard at the Communal conference on integrative oncology, which was co-sponsored by the Symington Foundation, who is sponsoring this series. So as soon as I heard Francis give his presentation, I rushed up to him and asked if he'd join us in this venture. And Francis, thank you very much for coming on to Getting to the Heart of Cancer.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
I'm very grateful. Let's begin with giving people a chance to know your background, both you might say professionally, but also how you got into the healing work and how cancer itself has impacted you, and let's just jump right in.
Okay. I've been a psychotherapist for 35 years, and there was always something about the approach of therapy that didn't quite touch what I wanted to touch. And then I came into the work of James Hillman and the soul-centered approach to work, and that felt much more genuine to what I felt needed to happen in the work in the office. I was licensed very young. I was licensed at 27 years old. And I was wise enough at that point to know I needed mentoring. And so I apprenticed myself to this ancient man. He must have been 60. He was so old. But the first time I sat down with Clark, he reached over and patted this big rock he had by his side, and he said, "This is my clock. I operate at geologic speed.
Wow.
And if you're going to work with the soul, you need to know this rhythm, because this is how the soul moves." And then he pointed to his clock, and he said, and it hates this. That was probably the single most important lesson I ever received in tongue therapy, is patience. Learning to attend to the rhythm of soul. How does it move? It moves slowly. And we are addicted to speed in this culture. The second piece of that story was how much the conditioning of psychology was geared towards strength and almost like a heroic crusade to improve, to always get better. But I was always drawn to the other side of that equation, to what was weak, what was suffering, what felt outcast, what was defeated. And that, again, that's where I found soul. That's where it got intimate. That's where it got vulnerable. It wasn't in our strengths. It was in the places where we felt tenderized and brought to our knees in some true way, right? The cancer piece came in, back one more step in there, is the grief work began probably around 20 years ago. And I began to see that people coming into my practice and people who I was working with out in public events were often complaining about depression. But what I realized, it was oppression. It was untouched sorrow. It was layers and layers of consolidated grief that had never been touched, never had a place to be spoken and expressed, particularly communally. Even when they did touch it, would come to a private practice, right? Private. Everything was so private. And what I felt the need was for communal, because that was the most ancient premise for healing sorrow, was communal. Grief has always been communal until now. And now it's exceedingly private, almost shameful.
How did you come across the insight that grief traditionally is processed communally? Because you probably didn't get that in graduate school.
No, I didn't get that in graduate school. I got that actually through a friendship with an African teacher named Malidoma Some. And Malidoma had come to this country in the early 90s, I believe. And I first studied with him in I think 95, 96. I did a year-long program with him, which in itself evoked tremendous grief. The training was on Ritual Village. And I was finding myself back in the context that my soul expected, but did not receive. So it brought up tremendous sorrows. And then we were addressing the sorrow through communal grief rituals. So I began to get curious about, this is not how we do it.
It's a whole new world.
Even our funerals are oppressive for the most part.
What are you thinking of there?
Well, even, people apologize for crying at a funeral nowadays. I'm sorry I lost control. I'm so sorry. Didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. But I mean, that's not true. Like in the African American churches, they know how to grieve. But we have lost. See, I don't see grief as only an emotion, but it's also a faculty. It's a capacity. It's a skill. And we've lost the skill. It's, in a sense, that muscle, that ability to really work grief through is become very unfamiliar and unknown and almost frightening for many people.
It's part of emotional intelligence.
Is exactly right.
We don't teach so much.
Not so much. And I think we're phobic around grief. Again, that's part of that heroic ascension culture. Always be in control, always know what you're doing, don't admit failure or frailty. And so we tend to, again, suppress and oppress those territories. And then the last piece of that was the grief, working with the cancer patients at the Commonweal. You can't avoid it there.
Tell me a little bit about that work, because I'm not aware of actually what they've done with.
Well, they do
patients.
six retreats a year with 8 people who come from all over the country, all over the world, to spend a week together addressing the various components of cancer. I do the group therapy work and an individual therapy with them. And my work in the group is to basically invite what is precipitated as a consequence of what I call this rough initiation. Initiation traditionally was meant to break something open in the psyche, right? There's a severing from the world that you knew. There's a radical change in identity. And there's a profound sense that you can never go back to the world that was. Well, think about cancer. When that diagnosis is made, you lose the world that you were in. There's a radical change in identity, and you cannot go back to the way it was. That precipitates a tremendous amount of grief. You know, these rough initiations activate tremendous sorrows. There's the loss of a reliable future, dreams, parts of your body begin to disappear. Friendships are often taxed to the max, and they fade away. So there's a lot of sorrow that comes along with the cancer diagnosis, and
there's loss of capacity.
Loss of capacity.
Loss of income.
Yes.
Sometimes.
Yes. Oh, yeah. There's many, many layers to this grief. Again, that rarely has a chance to be expressed. And the medical establishment colludes with that too, around always focusing on hope. Nothing wrong with that by any stretch. But what about those parts of us that feel despair, that feel hopeless? So when I'm working with the groups, I say, this is your invitation to become immense. You have to get your arms around all of this. You can't just focus on being positive, being hopeful, because these other brothers and sisters are there, whether we acknowledge them or not. I remember one woman saying she had 2 young children at home. She was a 35-year-old mother with stage 4 breast cancer, and she was terrified of this disease and what it was going to do to her children if she should die. So she said, I'm fighting this darkness every day. And I said, well, how much energy goes into that fight?
Yeah.
And how much does that take away from
Healing.
Your children? So can you imagine putting your arms around that dark sister and seeing her as an invitation to become large? Imagine walking home this big. And on Sunday, as she was leaving, she said, I'm going home with my dark sister.
Wow.
So
beautiful.
This is hard work, but that is the core of the work, I think.
When my wife was diagnosed with a lymphoma a couple of years ago, I came home and I just wailed. I mean, it's been a long time since I'd cried that deeply, and I was terrified, absolutely terrified. And our walking was challenging, but it was relatively short-lived. We were into remission relatively quickly. Nothing like what many people have to walk through, but for me, I was on my knees crying, praying. It was terrifying.
It's terrifying.
It really was.
Yeah. It again is that rough initiation that tears apart the foundations of everything that we just rely upon. We assume that our life will go on undeterred.
Yeah.
That's the fantasy, right? But then life happens, and we are thrown into these convulsions of loss and terror. And I think the really essential thing that we have to do, and part of what the beauty of Communal is that we remember we need a village to hold this. The weight of this is too big for any single human being or even a couple to hold in isolation. So I think one of the essential teachings is that what is required of us is a willingness to be held by many. See, grief requires two things. It requires containment and release. But if I'm doing it by myself, I'm stuck. I can't do both jobs, right? So I become a permanent containment field for grief until the container is offered, which is the village, which is a friendship. That's the container. Then I've got one job to do, which is to grieve. So we're not meant to pack around grief for a lifetime. We're not meant to have a U-Haul of sorrow, dragging behind us. Most indigenous cultures say that grief is a toxin that is meant to be expelled regularly. That's why they have rituals consistently. If we were a sane culture, we'd have grief rituals every month. We have people traveling literally thousands of miles. We have people, one man came from England in April to this grief ritual in Burlingame. I said, it's wonderful you're coming, however, was it 9,000 miles? I don't know how far that is. But that's also a symptom of our grief, that this isn't happening in my community. I have to travel thousands of miles to find a place that will sanctify my opportunity to grieve. Do you hear that? Yeah. That's at the heart of our sorrow. This background grief of how alone we are with our grief. So that's really a big piece of what we're trying to mend by offering these times together, is to reknit the primal matrix under which grief was addressed. It was not meant to be done alone.
I was I consulted with an oncology, an outpatient oncology group to help support them in these kinds of processes. And that was one of the things we, wanted to achieve, was to create an opportunity for the staff to have ritualized grief. When, they lost a patient that everybody in the unit, deeply cared for, been working with for years. And we weren't able to get that far, and I think I might suggest that they consult with you.
Well, yeah. It takes...
Because this is true for healthcare professionals.
Absolutely.
Too, because they've got another patient to take care of, another patient, and there's no time.
We have a lot of hospice workers in our retreats, a lot of doctors, because what they're facing every single day is this accumulated sorrow that has no place to go. But again, we're dealing with that heroic model. And it's so hard, particularly for men, to set down that heroic ideal of muscling your way through. So at the beginning of our retreats, we said we're going to begin to try to experiment with what it looks like to think like a village. It's a very different kind of thought process. So I'll say to them, when we get to the ritual on Sunday, you may or may not grieve, but the woman or the man sitting next to you might. And if they grieved, we wept. Because the next time it might be your turn and I'll be there for you. We're so singularly minded. What did I get? How did I do? But in the village context, did we grieve together? Did we get there? And even if I didn't grieve, I feel different by being with those who did, knowing full well that my turn will come. It took me 3 grief rituals before I shed my first tear. I was a well-packed white male, I knew how to hold on and be in control, but I also knew I had this deep well of grief. So I thought that even the third time I was there, nothing's happening. Then a dear friend came by and just put his hand on my shoulder. And the next thing I knew, that was it. I was on my knees for hours, weeping, just weeping, and it is so restorative to be side by side with others who are grieving. There's no questions to be asked. Like, hey, how you doing? We know. It's fully transparent in the moment of grief what is happening. And it is holy ground.
Very.
It is holy ground.
I remember 40 years ago, my first Sufi teacher said, watch the toddlers. And so we watched the toddlers, and toddlers will fall down and cry like full on for, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 60 seconds. And then they kind of pop up as if nothing happened.
Right.
And his assessment from that particular Sufi point of view was crying was the natural way the body reestablishes the natural rhythm of the breath. Yeah. And when the breath is in the natural rhythm, then the chi can flow, the energy can flow. Yeah. And of course, we program that out.
Yes, we are conditioned very quickly to tighten up, to pull it back in, and again, not show the weakness.
Do you think, my dad told me a man doesn't have moods. Do you think that's the thing we're talking about?
Yes, I think that's a lot of what we're talking about. Men don't cry, men don't feel.
Or I'll give you something to cry about.
Or I'll give you something to cry about.
Yeah. The other, another aspect that comes to me when you're talking about containment versus grieving is in the Sufi healing work, we have a lot of emphasis on teaching people to receive in their heart. So on a human level, it's receiving human care. On the, you might say, inner planes, it's receiving divine support, which we perceive really as light that literally comes into the heart and help opens it. And I know for me, just receiving was a big deal. So I remember talk about different workshops. It was probably 25 years ago where I think the leader of the workshop looked at me and said, we got, Houston, we have a problem here. So they had everybody in the small group, pick me up and carry, they call it a wave now, but, carry me around. Yeah. And I'd never felt support like that. It was, kind of a 1970s workshop, old standard, but made a big difference. And so a lot of it is teaching people how to receive, and caregivers are big on feeling they have to contain. And if I cry, that's going to make it harder for the patient who has the disease. And so we need to teach caregivers just how to receive. And then that can help in this process of moving into grieving and being supported by their community or their village, as you're saying.
Right.
Have you found that to be
a lot of, like I say, a lot of people who come to the retreats are caregivers. And there is almost like a prohibition against them having the right to be held and to receive and to grieve. And this goes back to a deeper wound around belonging. Am I worthy of being in the circle? And again, this is another place where psychology hasn't done so well. When people come in here with an agenda of improvement, it's often a subtle form of self-hatred. That I have to get these parts of me fixed and repaired, otherwise I'll never be let into the circle. So they come in with this, my first words to my therapist many years ago when I arrived there was, I want you to help me get rid of a few parts of me,
You were clear.
Oh yeah, this shame boy, this sad boy. If I could just get rid of them, I'd be fine. Then they'd let me in the circle because I would measure up. I would look good. But of course, those are the pieces that actually brought me back into the human world. Was through the vulnerability, right? So a lot of the wounding has to do with, am I enough? And so a lot of caretakers find that role of being the caretaker is their ticket for at least a provisional welcome. And that itself is another form of grief. That I have had to earn love, that I've had to somehow work to prove that I'm worthy of being included. That's not just a given. That's not just, deep in the bone. When I spent some time in Africa, and I never felt so much envy in my whole life. at dusk every day, the common area would swell with people, and food would come out, and millet beer, and kids would be playing, and stories are being told, and if a child was nursing, that child could go to any mother with milk.
Huh.
It's not like, well, that's not my child. No, these are our children.
Mm.
And what I felt in their bones was this profound sense of that being settled, that I belong. That existential anxiety of, am I in or am I out? Which is a pervasive dynamic in this culture. We're always anxious about whether I'm good enough, smart enough, handsome enough, rich enough. There's always this ranking dynamic going on somewhere in our psyches about, am I in or am I out? That wasn't there.
Mm. Where was this in Africa, and why were you there?
I was visiting the village where my friend Malodoma Some lived.
Which country?
Burkina Faso, West Africa.
Feels very West African, actually,
Yeah.
what you're describing.
Yeah, it was amazing to watch that. Third poorest country in the world, I believe, at the time.
Mm.
But what they lacked materially, they were so far ahead of us. And what they granted to each soul was this profound sense of, you're in.
Mm.
Don't worry about that piece.
I remember taking some drumming training from an African master, what's his name?
Oh, the Tunji?
Tunji, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember he said, how can we prepare our children for the 21st century if they don't know how to drum and dance?
Right.
Like, whoa.
Right.
There's a perspective.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Beautiful man.
Yeah. Good man.
Beautiful.
Good man.
So I know in your work you've talked about grief as an initiatory process.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what does that mean to you? What's that world? What does that open up as for possibilities?
Well, I think grief is a threshold emotion. In other words, it kind of opens the door to an embodied experience of really being in this life. Because what it does is essentially says, I accept life on life's terms, not my terms. As long as I'm trying to assert my terms on life, we don't ripen. We don't mature. We don't cross the threshold of initiation. So I think the deepest truth about grief work is that it's a lifelong apprenticeship. You will find sorrow walking out the door after we're done talking today. You might see a homeless person. You might hear the news. There's grief around us all the time. And until we're ready to say yes to that, we stay insulated and small. Because at the heart of deep grief work is the preparation for elders. It is the tempering of elders who know the gravity of life, who've decided to turn their face full into that wind, and who have carried the weight of it and have been tempered by that process into someone who now can carry medicine for the younger ones. So that, again, the heart of it is that I often say that the work is to hold grief in one hand and gratitude in the other, and then to be stretched large by these two realities. And we become immense again by that gesture. Or we could say we find the prayer of life, because both are true simultaneously. Even in the heart of my deepest sorrow, I might hear a songbird. I might catch a glimpse of a rose or the kind touch of a friend. They're there side by side. But if I deny grief, my gratitude becomes shallow. And I never really cultivate true compassion for the suffering of others. So, but if I only pick up grief, I'll become bitter pretty quick and cynical, and my heart will shut. But if I can do that, if I can really open to life, its beauty, its exquisiteness, and its deep trenches of sorrow, then I become a human being, ripe for showing up for the community. Not, see, at the end of their grief rituals, we say, or actually, when I'm doing the invocation for the prayer, prior to going into the ritual on Sunday afternoon, I say, we're not doing this for ourselves alone. We're doing this so that our hearts may once again be broken open, so that we can bring more love to our families, to our children, more love into the streets. We do this to bless all, not just so that I feel better when I'm done grieving my 20 pounds of grief, but that I'm actually can once again say yes, more spaciously. I can taste joy again. You know, that's really what comes out of the grief work.
Beautiful. When you're talking about preparation for the elders, people in our viewers have heard us talk about our particular guide, our elder in our Sufi group, a man called Sidi Muhammad al-Jamal, who lived in the Mount of Olives and in Jerusalem, is really ground zero of trying to create peace in Jerusalem. And a man of deep love and deep joy and tremendous breadth. And he was staying at our house once, and a bunch of us were of the students. We were in the living room, just sort of, I don't know, having a good time. And he walks in with his beads. He'd often teach indirectly, but we were kind of like just frivolous, kind of like. And he walks in, and he sits down, and he was obviously in a very deep state. And he said, "There's so much suffering in this world." And then gets up and walks out. It's a real deep message that there's a lot going on now. Yes. And like I said, he was full of joy, but he also was in constant prayer for the suffering. That was all. He was tied in with people in groups all over the world. Yeah. So that was a big dose of, trying to, like, learning from him was very, created this vastness that you're talking about, over time. Yeah. Let me ask you a question, because I'm sure this operates inside of people. What's the potential, I'm just going to put it in a blunt way, what's the potential damage of sort of breaking open someone's grief? Like, could it ever be too much? Could it be, damaging, inappropriate, those kind of things? People would say, well, sometimes it's better not to do that. What's your perspective to people who, would have that concern?
I've never seen that happen.
Okay.
That being said, we have repressed a lot of sorrow in our lifetime. And our skill and our capacity to touch it. I mean, a lot of what I do in here is titrate, teaching them how to be in touch with it and how to step away from it. The work that I like to say is to come into right relationship with sorrow. Not too far away, because we kind of have this binary relationship where we either push it away or we're drowning in it. Neither one of them really works. But what's the right relationship? What's a companionship relationship to grief? As if I'm walking alongside of it constantly. It's always there. Several times, I would say maybe 4 or 5 times over the many, many rituals I've done, someone gets lost at the shrine. In other words, their grief overwhelms them. And I talk about that prior to going into the ritual, saying, if this happens, we are watching you very, very carefully. And if this begins to happen, we will take care of you. We will cool you down. Someone will come and put water on your hands and water on your forehead. They'll ask you to look them in the eyes. We'll pull you back. The worst that can happen, I think, with the grief is that grief begins to grieve grief.
What does that mean?
That means even in the depths, when you were sharing your story a little while ago about your wife's cancer diagnosis and you were wailing, you were aware of yourself wailing, right? There was still someone there going, man, this is intense. I am wailing heavily right now. You were aware of that. There can be a time when you lose that witness. That's when grief begins to grieve grief, and nothing's happening.
Right.
You're just spinning the wheel. So that's when we cool people down and begin to, bring them back to the village. They can just keep crying, but they're now in the container of the village. So for the most part, I think our trouble is on the other side of it.
Right.
So the big issue is that we don't trust grief. In other words, we are terrified of the terrain. People say, if I go in that room, I'm never coming back. And I say, yeah, but if we don't go in that room, you're never coming back.
I was going to say, what are the downsides of carrying what did you call it, a U-Haul?
Yes, because there's so much vitality locked in that room. I mean, we really think about a grief. It's not a past. I mean, when you were crying, was that a deadened state?
Mm-mm.
It was an incredibly alive, vital state. I remember one woman sobbing so heavily at one of the rituals. She said, at that moment, I felt so alive. Not good. We're attached to positivism so deeply, as if it's our fundamental right, And psychology, again, has this whole emphasis on positive psychology. Nothing wrong with that. But what I want is a vital psychology. There's vitality in sadness. There's vitality in anger. There's even vitality in my loneliness, if I can cultivate that, if I can work with it, So it's more often the opposite, is that our reluctance to go in there. And so frequently we don't have just grief, we have grief panic. When grief comes around, we begin to get scared because we don't trust it. This image came to me one time of giving grief a bottom. Because for many of us, when we had grief particularly in our youth, in our childhood, no one caught us, right? Or we were teased or ignored or get over it, or the message was, you're not going to get caught there. So when we get near it, it feels like there's no bottom. It's like we end up feeling like we're in free fall. So part of what we do in here and in the grief rituals is teach people that they can give grief a bottom again. And just like your teacher said, a toddler drops in, feels it fully, and then returns. There's a bottom. We trust the bottom. But if that bottom gets ripped away, man, it terrifies us to go there. So what we need to do, and that's what happens in the grief work with the cancer patients, is we have to learn how to give this a bottom so you can trust it again. Grief is never intending to hold us hostage. It doesn't want to take our lives over, but it wants to be honored. Because this is the way in which the heart maintains its participation in life. And if we shut down the door to grief, the heart begins to become cloistered and removes its presence from the world. And we cannot afford that right now. We need adults who have the capacity to feel this deeply so that we are registering the sorrows of the world. Otherwise, clear cuts and coal mines and none of these things will be responded to because our hearts will be numb. And in the Sufi tradition, that's a big thing, right?
Yeah.
To keep the heart open, juicy, and alive and open. So that's at the heart of grief work as well. Is we need us right now. We're desperately in need of us to keep our activism, our soul activism, churning so that we can respond with love, with compassion, but also with a certain fierceness to what is happening in the world. James Hillman said, the sure sign of a soul awake is outrage. You know? Yeah.
Yeah, I loved filming growing up. Not growing up, but early years of our marriage, we read a lot of his work, Jungian psychology. Yeah, good stuff.
Very good stuff. Very good stuff.
We talked actually before the interview about possibly leading a process for people in terms of how they might touch into grief right here using this this particular episode.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Sure.
And let's set it up.
Sure. I said that grief opens the heart to compassion for others, right? But self-compassion opens the gate to our own grief. Because frequently we don't feel like we're worthy of tending to our own grief. It's either, not as bad as somebody else, or that's being selfish, or,
right.
I've got to take care of other people. So I do a lot of work with self-compassion almost as a prelude to grief work. And when I teach self-compassion workshops, I often say this is a weekend in non-self-improvement.
A free pass.
Yes. Please, just for the next few hours, don't try to make anything better. Can we simply welcome what is?
Great.
So that's what I would invite.
Let's focus on the self-compassion.
That's what I would invite here is to spend a few moments thinking about some piece of your own life, whether it's grief or whether it's shame or a weakness or some piece of you that I call the outcast brother or the outcast sister. And there's many of them. And for a moment, imagine approaching this part of you with compassion. It's almost as if we have to, I often call it, imagine you're Jane Goodall. The chimps didn't just run up to her and say, I think that's Jane Goodall. She had to sit there for a long time before these animals came up and touched her or got in her lap. These parts of us that we've often treated with great contempt don't just come running back. So can we have the fidelity and the capacity to make amends for these parts of us that have oftentimes lived in the wasteland, lived without nourishment, without warmth, without soothing and comfort? Can you imagine for a few moments offering these outcast sisters and brothers kindness, mercy, compassion? And just sit with that for a minute or two as you extend the outreach of compassion to the least of your brothers and sisters, to the ones who carry your suffering. And as you do that, you may notice that these pieces of you carry great sorrow from having been banished and exiled. Be willing to touch that sorrow. Be willing to pick that up as your piece in the reclamation of this lost aspect of your life. Through your tears, you bathe, you baptize, you welcome what needs to be welcomed back. This is a fundamental practice to restoring our sense of belonging, our sense of being at home. Belonging can never be achieved without our outcast brothers and sisters also sitting at the table. We will never trust that welcome until they're also sitting there. Thank you. Okay. A moment.
A moment.
Mm-hmm.
Where I went with that was seeing the part of me for most of my life who had been scared to talk to people, and how many opportunities, known and unknown, I just lost.
Yeah.
Because people occurred to me as scary.
Yeah. And the grief that's right there in your eyes right now,
Yeah.
you know. Yeah. And that's our job. Our work is to process all of the grief that we've asked them to carry for us. You know, we've pushed these pieces away so we wouldn't have to feel what's the consequence of this loss. But to bring them back in, we have to go through that waterfall of grief. And be the one now who's willing to carry that. Say, I'm so sorry. I did a ritual with a group of men down in Southern California with the Outcast Brothers. We took 5 large stones.
What are the Outcast Brothers?
Well, this one.
Whatever you have in yourself.
Yeah,
they're brothers. Okay.
Yeah.
Because I've got Outcast sisters.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Yes, we do. We're very generous with our exclusions. But we put 5 large stones at the base of this enormous oak tree. And we were drumming and singing, and the instructions were very simple. That when you feel ready to go down there, lift the stone as if you're picking up the weight off the back of this boy and saying, it's my turn to carry this now. I'm so sorry I've asked you to carry this for so long. And it was astonishingly powerful. You could feel it. They would say, I could feel it transferring into my arms. Only the adult can process this. That child part of us has a skill set about this big, you know. But the adult has a little bit more room and more capacity to process those feeling states. So it was astonishingly beautiful to see these men just weeping as they picked up the weight off of the back of this boy who's been just bent over with shame and inadequacy and worthlessness and weakness and all the things that men are told not to be, you know. But when we finally welcome, that's the basis for our communion. It's through those very brothers.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
In your experience with cancer patients specifically, any other experiences come to mind that can help sort of illustrate what people have gone through in their own healing journeys, whether in the group setting or in the private setting?
Well, lots of images come to mind. I think the one that's most relevant right now is that same idea of healing it has the same root origin as whole, right? So the work with the cancer circles is really about holding, and about beginning to see who has been silenced and pushed out. And at the same time, how big do we have to be in order to welcome them? So there's a woman who was sharing about having gone to the Grand Canyon on a solo trip. And this was before her diagnosis. And was standing there and had this mystical experience of feeling She was as vast as the Grand Canyon, just deep in her heart, just broke her open to that immensity. She said, but then I came back and a week later I was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. She started talking. I said, wait, just stop just for a second. What happened to the woman standing at the lip of the Grand Canyon? She said, what do you mean? So that's how big we have to be now. And that became the metaphor for the whole group, that we have to put our arms around despair and grief and hopelessness. We can't treat those parts of us as unwelcomed guests. They will come, right? In the midst of that cancer journey, I don't know anybody who hasn't tasted that part of the meal. But we frequently want to push it away, deny it, because if I think about it, it somehow strengthens it. That childhood fantasy, But no, when we can put our arms around it, the whole feeling state changes, because now I have become the one capable of holding everything, excluding nothing, and saying yes to the whole experience of being a human being with this situation.
There's a principle in Sufism that the Gnostics have noted and succinctly said it's that God or Spirit often gives before the need arises. So like she was given, the timing can't be coincidental. Like she was given this experience of the completeness of who she was.
Yep.
And that had to have been deep medicine for her. And
profound.
The fact that you sort of said, wait a minute, this is not a throwaway experience.
Right.
Right. It was brilliant. And obviously it was helpful for the whole group.
Yeah. And that's that same thought from earlier in our conversation, that this is not meant for us alone. And I give the circle, the cancer circles, 10 practices that help to optimize the healing response in their journey. The first one is, you can do them in any order you want, except for number 1. Okay. Number 1 is number 1, and that's self-compassion. Because we're so harsh on ourselves. People come in blaming themselves for the cancer.
That's right.
Right? What did I do wrong? Did I eat too much sugar? I knew I shouldn't have, and we're attacking ourselves. And the only response that makes sense is mercy, right?
Absolutely.
It's compassion.
Yeah.
And the last one I give them is service. I say at some point in your healing journey, you'll know when the time is right, but this was not meant for you alone. At some point, you'll be asked to share the wisdom you have gathered as you walk this difficult path, and you'll be asked to toss it like seed, to give it away. This was not meant just for you.
It's like the 12-step program.
Yes.
The last step is service. 12-step, I think.
The last piece of that weekend, I often say the week-long is, there's a saying from South Africa that when death finds you, make sure it finds you alive. So that's what we're after, is the whole dynamic aliveness that comes from whatever is there. And like I said, grief is not depression. Grief is subversive. It is a wild animal. It is a presence in us that shakes us to our knees. You were not in control at that moment.
No.
Right?
Not at all.
Not at all. And nor did you feel deadened.
No.
Like I said. So when death finds us, make sure it finds us alive. And that means accepting and welcoming and meeting and digesting and metabolizing it all into something nutrient dense. So that whatever we touch, our children, our friends, our communities, are blessed even by our death. That becomes a blessing. Yeah.
Beautiful. In the Sufi tradition, God describes itself by many qualities, but the preeminent two qualities that you might say divinely revealed, like know me as this above all other things, is mercy and compassion.
We're in good company.
We're in good company. That's key. Can you share with us some of the other, the 8 other?
Oh, sure. If I can just love,
divine prescriptions.
love and friendship. To not try to muscle your way through in isolation. Creativity. That the soul really aches for a way of expressing our experience. Imagination. Time. Time in the sense of finding moments in your day where you do absolutely nothing. And this drives people crazy. Because one of our only ways of adjusting for value is productivity. But going back to geologic speed, I really encourage people to have time in the day where you just sit, watch, listen, waste the time.
And the Grand Canyon is such a perfect image for that, because it didn't happen even in 10,000 or 100,000 years.
No,
it's
no.
a big time scale.
Yeah, yeah. What other ones are there? I'm not remembering it right at the moment, but let's see. Ritual. Ritual was another one. To find gestures that you can make on your own or with others that consistently create the arc between the human and the more than human. Nature is another one. These are practices that, if we look at them independently, they are what shaped us as human beings in our long story. All I'm saying is, let's go back to the primary satisfactions, is what I call them. Let's go back to the things that shaped us as human beings and satisfied us at a very core level. And when we lose the primary satisfactions, which again is another source of profound grief for us, of gathering nightly to share food and wake up in the morning and share dreams and go out and gather firewood. And
yeah, it's like, really? Is that possible? Wow.
That's what we were shaped in, right? Storytelling under the stars. All of these things are what shaped us. Ritual, beauty. Oh, beauty was another one of the 10 practices. Beauty, James Hillman said, beauty is the means by which the gods touch the senses, reach the heart, and attract us into life. Lovely phrase.
Beautiful.
So without beauty, what is it that attracts us into life? So bring flowers into your home, the music that delights you, makes you want to dance. So these are all practices that are primary satisfactions. In the absence of those, we go for secondary satisfactions. Wealth, material goods, rank, privilege, food addictions. Right. These things, but they never satisfy the soul.
You never get enough of what you don't really want.
Exactly. the addict's motto, right? Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Well, before we finish our conversation, we could go on for much longer.
Yes.
Is there anything else that you'd like to say, share, recommend?
I think the heart of it is to be willing to invite others into this conversation. That wherever you are in your journey, whether it's cancer or any other crisis, because life is going to touch us that way, invite others into the conversation with that. This was not meant to be done alone. The great American heroic enterprise of individualism has achieved many things, but one of its most enormous shadows is that we are deprived of the things we need when most in need, which is being held and supported, comforted. So I often You don't have to have a grief ritual to go to. You can invite 4 or 5 friends over to your house on Friday night and say, tonight the topic is loss. But let's agree to a few things. Let's not try to give any advice. Let's not try to fix anybody. Let's just make a deep, rich space of listening, because no one has been spared this visitor. We all know that this is the commons of the soul. Let's be together and grant each other the privilege of speaking about grief, loss, sorrow. And in the end, we might feel a little different. You know?
And the privilege of listening without trying to fix, but just feeling undivided, heartful listening.
When we do the grief rituals, there's the community, the village is up here singing a chant that we've taught them. There's drummers, and then there's the grief shrine, the healing area. You go down to the healing area, and you can go down as many times as you want, but you never go down alone. The moment you take off, someone steps in behind you and is holding that space for as long as you're there and giving you whatever you need while you're there. If you want to be touched, they'll touch you. The only thing they won't do is talk to you, because the conversation at the shrine is between you and the mystery. It's not between you and humans. We don't resolve grief between human beings. Grief is resolved between us and that mystery. In many cultures, they say that grief is the nutrient base for the ancestors. It feeds them. So if we stop grieving, the ancestors stop eating, and we feel even more alone in the world.
And how does it feed the ancestors? What's your understanding?
That's above my pay grade, I think.
I was going to say, it sounds pretty deep.
But I mean,
it does give you a sense of, from that culture, what their role is.
Yeah, I mean, in Maldives,
deeply present.
They say that the deceased soul cannot get to the land of the ancestors without a river of tears. So it gives the village a purpose. Their funerals last 3 days. They're weeping, weeping, and weeping, and weeping for 3 days to get that soul to where it needs to go. And Rilke, Rainer Marie Rilke, had a poem that has the same intimation. He says, it's possible I am pushing through solid rock in flint-like layers as the ore lies alone. I am such a long way in, I see no way through. Everything is close to my face, and everything close to my face is stone. I don't have much knowledge yet in grief. So this massive darkness makes me small. You be the master. Make yourself fierce. Break in. Then your great transforming can happen to me, and my great grief cry can happen to you. He wrote that at 27 years old. How did he know that his great grief cry was a gift to God, to Spirit? Huh? That's astonishing. That's an intuition that dives right back into what we're just talking about. So,
beautiful.
Yeah.
Francis Weller, thank you very much. This was just rich and very special.
Thank you, John. I enjoyed every moment.
Me too.
Thank you.
I'm very grateful for the interview that Francis gave us, and I trust you will have found much value in that. If you'd like to follow up with Francis, you can go to his website, francisweller.net. There you can sign up for a free newsletter. There's a description of his workshop schedule there. And also the book that he wrote, Wild Edge of Sorrow, is a great read and is a wonderful follow-up to the material on this interview. Our next episode is a blend of the traditional and the modern. Traditional practices in the Sufi tradition come out of the field of what's called prophetic medicine. We'll be exploring the world of plant medicines, the world of wet cupping, and in a more modern application, you'll have a chance to hear about special retreats that we do with cancer patients and what can happen, the deep healing that can happen in that context. And also an interview with a colleague of mine, Dr. Mark Bricka, naturopath who is deeply experienced in caring for people with cancer and has a deep understanding of the nutritional approaches to cancer. So you're going to definitely want to join us for our next episode of Getting to the Heart of Cancer. And remember, come to our website. Please tell us what you thought of this particular interview, what value you're getting out of the program. Share with us your experiences with cancer and your own spiritual perspectives around what you found valuable in this, what we call Cancer, the Journey of Love. Thank you very much for joining us. Look forward to having you back.